At 15, I met Roger. He embodied everything I imagined a true man to be: confident, secure, affectionate. While boys my age barely knew what they wanted, he seemed to have everything under control. When he looked at me, I felt special, as if he saw something in me that no one else did. We met at a family gathering. He was a cousin of a distant friend, and he engaged me in a conversation unlike any I'd experienced before. He spoke like an adult, inquiring about my dreams, my passions. I was captivated. The following day, he messaged me. That's when everything began. Initially, everything was perfect. He'd pick me up from school, bring flowers, tell me I was beautiful, even on days when I felt utterly worthless. His attentiveness made me believe no one else in the world could love me as much as he did. I felt safe, protected, as if I'd found someone who would care for me forever. But gradually, things started to shift. He'd say my friends were too childish. For me, that I should focus on our relationship. "You need to think about the future, Letícia," he'd say. I found those words so mature, so responsible. Unconsciously, I began distancing myself from my friends. One day, my best friend Camila pulled me aside at school. She asked if I thought Roger's controlling nature was unusual. I laughed, dismissing her concerns. "He just cares about me," I said. Camila tried to argue, but I felt so uncomfortable that I distanced myself from her as well. A specific day stands out. A childhood friend messaged me, asking if I still played the guitar. When Roger saw it, he remained silent for a while, his gaze making me uneasy. Then he said, "I trust you, but people aren't always well-intentioned. I just want to protect you." In that moment, I felt guilty for responding to my friend. My outings with my friends decreased. Whenever I went to the mall or the movies with them, Roger's comments made me reconsider. "Don't you feel out of place among them?" Or, "You know, I prefer to be with you, don't you?" And I convinced myself that he simply wanted to spend more time with me. My mother started noticing something amiss. One day, she commented, "Don't you think you're getting too attached to Roger? Where's the Letícia who didn't depend on anyone?" But I didn't listen. I was certain he was my safe haven, that no one understood me like he did. Now, looking back, I see that everything was part of a larger picture, something I couldn't grasp at the time. But at 15, with a heart full of illusions, I believed I was experiencing true love. I didn't realize the first chains were being subtly forged, one by one. At 17, I decided I wanted to marry Roger. There was no doubt in my mind. He was the man of my life, the person who loved me more than anyone else. My parents, of course, weren't convinced. My mother said I was too young, that I had so much more to experience. My father, more rigid, tried to make me understand that I was rushing things, but I persisted. Roger did too. He was so persuasive. He spoke of the future we would build together, of how he wanted to care for me and protect me from everything. After much discussion and tears, my parents relented. They signed the papers so I could marry before turning 18. I recall the excitement of that day. My dress was simple, yet I felt like a princess. Roger was there with that confident smile, telling me everything would be all right. For the first few months, everything felt like a dream. He'd say I was the most beautiful woman in the world and that he was proud to have married me. But things slowly began to change. Shortly after the wedding, Roger made it clear he didn't want me to work or study. "You don't need that," he'd say. "I'll take care of everything. Your only concern should be our home." At first, I even liked the idea. I thought it was a testament to his love. But over time, the feeling of being trapped began to grow. I saw my friends going to college, getting jobs, going out partying, while my routine remained the same: cleaning, the house, cooking, waiting for Roger to come home. When I tried to talk to him about it, he became serious, almost cold. "I only want the best for you, Letícia. It's not fair for you to exhaust yourself with work. I want you to be happy, and your happiness is here, with me." Those words, once so sweet, now sounded like a sentence. I vividly recall a specific day when I felt suffocated. It was a school friend's birthday, and she'd invited me to a small gathering. When I mentioned it to Roger, he sighed. "Don't you think you're past this phase? These parties aren't for a married woman." His words struck me like a physical blow. I declined the invitation. My mother continued to gently challenge my perspective. "Don't you find it odd that he wants to control everything? You were so full of dreams, Letícia." But my response remained consistent. "He only wants what's best for me." Roger possessed a way of making me feel guilty for any yearning for independence. One evening, while watching television, he commented on a woman who, in his view, was destroying her own family by seeking independence. He looked at me directly and stated, "I hope you never think that way." At that moment, I simply nodded, but inwardly, I felt increasingly adrift. I didn't realize it then, but Roger's control wasn't love, it was power. And I was succumbing gradually, without acknowledging the tightening chains around me. It was when I discovered I was pregnant that I hoped everything would change. I was 19 years old, and despite the preceding events, I still held on to the belief that Roger could revert to the man I had fallen in love with. When I shared the news, he appeared pleased. He embraced me tightly, proclaiming he would be the world's best father. For a brief moment, I felt confident in my hope. In the initial days, he was attentive, inquiring about my well-being, expressing that our family was about to become complete. However, as time wore on, he reverted to his prior distant and cold demeanor. If I complained of fatigue or discomfort, he'd respond, "You need to be strong. That's how women do it." My pregnancy was challenging, not just physically, but emotionally. I felt isolated, even with Roger present. I continued my daily household chores, but now with a doubled burden. He offered no assistance. He never did. When I requested help, his response was, "You know I work hard. I can't do everything." At night, I began to have unsettling dreams. I saw a tall, imposing female figure, her dark hair swirling like smoke. Her eyes shone, but I couldn't discern if their brilliance stemmed from anger or compassion. In these dreams, she never spoke, but always pointed to something I couldn't see. These dreams began to trouble me, but I had no one to confide in. Roger remained detached from the specifics of my life, and my mother, always concerned, had begun to accept that my marriage was a choice only I could alter. One day, while cleaning the kitchen, something transpired. I was alone in the house and experienced a sudden chill. The lights flickered, and I heard a sound, like a whisper, emanating from somewhere in the living room. When I looked, there was no one there, yet I felt as if I were being observed. I dismissed it, attributing it to exhaustion. But these fleeting incidents started repeating. Objects would fall inexplicably, and with each occurrence, I felt that same shiver. Nonetheless, the birth of my daughter brought a sliver of light into my life. When I held her in my arms for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: genuine happiness. She was perfect, so small and fragile, and I knew I would do anything to protect her. But even this didn't cause Roger to change. He seemed even more distant, as if the presence of our daughter were a burden to him. "You have to take care of her, Letícia. That's a mother's job," he'd say, as he hurried off to his engagements. I was exhausted, juggling a household, a baby, and myself, but he didn't recognize it. Deep down, I already knew something was amiss. Something larger than just my marriage. It was as if I were being tested, challenged to find a way out. And that gaze from the figure in my dreams, I still didn't understand, but I felt she was watching, waiting for me to make a decision. I was utterly drained. My life revolved around caring for my home, my daughter, and simply surviving each day. Roger's presence became increasingly absent. He left for work early and returned late, always with excuses at the ready. Initially, I believed him. But over time, I started noticing inconsistencies. There were nights when he claimed to be working late, but he returned with a different scent, a mixture of sweet perfume and something I couldn't identify. He'd leave his phone on silent, always, face down. And when I asked him questions, he'd answer too quickly, as if concealing something. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. Perhaps exhaustion, a demanding routine, isolation, all contributed to a growing distrust, a shadow within me. Then one day, while Rogerio was showering, I saw his phone on the table. He never left his phone unattended, and that in itself was unusual. My hands trembled as I picked up the device. I didn't want to look, but something inside me compelled me to. And there they were, messages, conversations with women I didn't know, using words he never used with me. He called them beautiful, my love. He made plans with them while I was at home, alone, caring for our daughter. The ground seemed to fall away. My body grew cold, my vision blurred. I wanted to scream, to confront him then and there, but our daughter was sleeping in the room next door. When he emerged from the shower, I was in the kitchen, feigning normalcy, but I couldn't look at him the same way. Every word he spoke sounded hollow. He asked what was wrong, and I lied. Nothing, just tired. He believed me. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard that sound again. A whisper emanating from somewhere in the room. My heart pounded. I opened my eyes and saw something in the wardrobe mirror. It wasn't my reflection, nor Rogerio's. It was her, the figure of my dreams. Her eyes shone, and her presence seemed to fill the entire room. She didn't speak, but I felt as if she were communicating with me, beckoning me. The mirror clouded over, and when I blinked, she was gone. Yet, the feeling of being watched persisted. The next morning, as Rogerio prepared to leave, I confronted him. I questioned him about the messages, the women. He didn't immediately deny it. He merely smiled that way that made me feel insignificant. "You're crazy, Letícia. It must be in your head." But I knew it wasn't. I knew that for the first time, I was seeing who he truly was. And in that moment, something within me shifted. I didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. I couldn't continue living that way. Following that night, something transformed within me. It wasn't just the pain of discovering the betrayal or the hatred for Rogerio. It was something deeper, as if I had crossed an unreturnable threshold. I knew I couldn't continue like that, but I didn't know how to escape the situation. Then, a few days later, I heard about Ivana. My neighbor, a woman who rarely spoke to me, stopped me in the building's hallway. "You're not well, Letícia. Seek out Ivana. She can help you." I found it strange. Who was Ivana? But something about the way my neighbor spoke piqued my curiosity. When I arrived at the address she gave me, it was a simple home, yet it possessed a distinct aura. It seemed old, but not abandoned. The air was scented with incense, and there was a palpable sense of weight to the atmosphere. I almost turned back, but a woman opened the door before I could. Ivana was tall, slender, and had a gaze that seemed to pierce my soul. Her eyes were intense, almost intimidating, but her voice was soft. "You came for the right reason. Come in." I hesitated, but entered. The interior of the house was filled with unfamiliar objects. Candles, statues of female figures, and symbols I'd never seen before. Ivana offered me tea, and while I struggled to comprehend what was unfolding, she began to speak, as if she already knew everything. "You feel trapped, Letícia. Suffocated, isn't it? He controls you, manipulates you, and now you've discovered his infidelity. You want out, but you don't know how." I felt a shiver. How did she know? I hadn't uttered a word. Then she mentioned Lilith. "Do you know Lilith?" I shook my head, confused. Ivana continued, "Lilith is an ancient force, a woman who never accepted subjugation. She is power, freedom, and she is calling you." That frightened me. "Calling me? How?" I asked. Ivana smiled slightly. "The dreams, the shadows. Did you think they were coincidences? They aren't. She's trying to show you that you don't have to live like this, but accepting her help comes with a price." My mind raced. I recalled the dreams, the figure in the mirror. Was it real? Was I imagining everything? Ivana seemed to read my thoughts. "I know you're afraid, but the decision is yours. If you wish, I can guide you to her. But know that this choice cannot be undone." I didn't answer immediately. I was frightened, but I also felt something different. A strength. A will I didn't. No, I possessed. I looked at Ivana and asked, "What if I don't accept?" She looked at me seriously. "Then you'll remain where you are, but I think you already know the answer." I left, my mind filled with thoughts. I was adrift, yet deep within, a decision had been made. I could no longer endure the confinement Rogerio had constructed for me. And somehow, I knew Lilith held the key. Following my encounter with Ivana, my thoughts revolved around nothing else. Her words echoed in my mind. "She is calling to you." It seemed preposterous, yet everything fell into place. The dreams, the whispers, the figure in the mirror, as if something greater was striving to reach me, to liberate me from that prison. Days later, I returned to Ivana's home. I wasn't sure what I sought, but I knew I couldn't continue as before. When Ivana opened the door, there was no surprise on her face. "I knew you would return," she said, a faint smile gracing her lips. She led me to a chamber that resembled an altar. The air was thick, laden with the scent of incense and flickering. Candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Symbols were etched into the floor, and an unnerving sense of vastness pervaded the space, as if something beyond my sight existed. Ivana explained the necessary steps. "This ritual is not for the faint of heart. You must confront your fears, relinquish everything that binds you. Lilith will show you the way, but you must be prepared to accept it." My voice trembled. "What if I am not ready?" Ivana's gaze was unwavering. "Then she will know." I knelt at the center of the circle etched on the floor. Ivana began to chant in a language unknown to me, yet the words resonated within me, as if I understood without comprehension. The air grew heavier, and the candlelight shadows danced erratically, as if imbued with life. Suddenly, I felt something. It was an inner warmth, expanding, consuming my body. My eyes closed, and when I opened them, she was there. Lilith. She was imposing, with long dark hair that seemed to swirl around her like smoke. Her eyes shone with a mesmerizing golden hue. She was not frightening, yet not comforting either. She was powerful. Lilith approached without uttering a word. She extended her hand, and in her palm rested a key, gleaming like gold, yet with edges that appeared to blaze. As I gazed at her, I felt a shift within me. It wasn't fear. It was courage. Finally, she spoke, but her voice seemed not external, but internal, originating from the depths of my mind. "Break your chains. Choose freedom, but know that every freedom has a price." I extended my hand and grasped the key. The moment my fingers touched it, a surge of energy coursed through me. My body felt light, yet my mind was filled with images. My life until that point, moments of pain, moments of despair, and finally, a vision of something new, something I did not yet understand. When it ended, I was back at the altar. Ivana watched me with a serene smile. "You accepted," she said. I didn't fully grasp what had transpired, but I knew something within me had altered. For the first time, I felt strong, as if nothing could deter me. After that night, everything seemed different. I felt different. It was something beyond words, as if an unseen force had awakened within me, a courage I never knew I possessed. The first thing I noticed was my posture. I was no longer hunched over, trying to occupy the least possible space. My body felt more grounded, and when I looked in the mirror, there was something new in my eyes. They seemed to gleam with a light they had never held before. But the changes weren't solely physical. My daughter began to view me differently. Before, she always appeared worried, as if she carried the weight of our home, despite its small size. Now she smiled more. When I held her, I felt a connection we had never known. Rogerio, of course, sensed the shift. He didn't comment immediately, but I knew he was suspicious. His first attempt was to reassert his controlling nature. "You're different, Letícia. Don't you think you're talking too much to our daughter?" I looked at him, and for the first time, I wasn't intimidated. "Don't you think you're overly concerned with matters that don't concern you, Rogerio?" His response caught him off guard. He stood there for a few moments, speechless. It brought me a satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Yet, the nights remained intense. Whenever I closed my eyes, Lilith appeared. Her golden eyes shone in the darkness, and her voice was firm, yet unhurried. "You have begun, but you are not finished. Much remains to be done." I awoke with those words in my mind, as if they were a command. Subtle supernatural occurrences began to manifest, but unlike before, they no longer instilled fear. Flickering lights in my solitude, and the familiar warmth of the ritual whenever courage was needed, became commonplace. When Rogerio attempted to intimidate me during a financial argument, the heat surged through my chest before I responded. For the first time, he lowered his head and left the room without further contention. Gradually, I began to reconnect with myself. I resumed activities that Rogerio had suppressed for so long. I picked up my guitar, the very instrument he had dismissed as a waste of time. As my fingers danced across the strings, my daughter rushed towards me, her smile so radiant it brought tears to my eyes. In that moment, I realized my transformation wasn't solely personal. It extended to her. I was constructing something novel, something I never thought possible. Yet, I knew this newfound strength came at a cost. Whenever I sensed Lilith's presence, it felt like she was observing, assessing whether I lived up to my newfound resolve. This no longer frightened me. Instead, it confirmed my independence. Rogerio started to perceive a shift beyond his control. He had always been the architect of our dynamic, the one who dictated the rules of my life. But now that was changing. He was ill-equipped to handle this shift. Initially, he attempted to manipulate me as before. "Letícia, you must understand the outside world isn't safe. I only want to protect you." But I was transformed. I looked at him and, for the first time, responded, "I no longer require your protection, Rogerio. You aren't safeguarding me. You're imprisoning me." He remained silent, and I saw something I had never witnessed before. Insecurity. He had lost his grip. His world began to crumble. Rogerio had always concealed his true nature from others, but slowly, his mask began to slip. He lost his job after a dispute with his boss. A conflict he claimed was not his fault. Friends distanced themselves, likely unable to ignore his changing behavior. Conversely, I was gaining strength. I began to formulate my escape plan. It was no longer a distant aspiration. It was a tangible reality. I no longer feared Rogerio's reactions. When he challenged me, I responded. When he tried to diminish me, I held my ground. The final straw occurred one evening. Rogerio arrived home intoxicated, an unusual occurrence. He was agitated, complaining about everything and everyone. He tried to intimidate me, shouting and banging on the table, but instead of cowering, as I had done before, I stood my ground. "This is over, Rogerio. You no longer control me." He laughed, but it was a hollow sound. He knew he had lost. For the first time, he had no more control over me. The following morning, I took my daughter and left the house. It wasn't a desperate flight. It was a calculated decision. I knew precisely what I was doing. I had saved what little I could over the years, and Ivana had provided connections that could assist me. Once I left, I learned that things had worsened for Rogerio. He increased his drinking, squandering what remained of his resources. The house we shared was sold to settle debts, and he relocated to a small apartment in a secluded neighborhood. One night, I dreamt of Lilith. She stood in a dark field, observing from afar as Rogerio wandered aimlessly. "The chains have been broken," she stated, without looking at me. I awoke with a sense of relief I had never experienced before. I knew that even from afar, Rogerio was facing the consequences of his choices. And for the first time in years, that didn't concern me. My life, finally, was my own. The initial days after leaving were challenging. I was in a small space with limited resources, but there was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. For the first time, I could breathe without fear, without worrying about Rogerio's judgmental gaze or his undermining remarks. My daughter, though still young, seemed to sense this shift. She played more, smiled more, and this gave me the strength to persevere. I knew I was starting anew, but simultaneously, I felt like I was finally building something of my own. It was then that I decided to venture into social media. I began with simple videos, showcasing recipes I used to prepare at home. Initially, I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing. I filmed with my phone propped up on books, using the kitchen light as illumination. Everything was improvised, and the initial videos didn't garner much attention. There were moments when I considered giving up. My online video recipes faced criticism for their amateurish quality. Yet, whenever doubts arose, an inner drive propelled me forward. A familiar warmth, like a ritualistic comfort, enveloped me. It felt as if Lilith was there, encouraging me. Gradually, my videos improved. I invested my meager resources in a better camera and lighting. I learned editing, background music, and projecting a more confident voice. My efforts were noticed. A follower wrote, "Your story and recipes inspire me. Thank you for sharing." This touched me deeply. I realized I wasn't just cooking. I was demonstrating the possibility of rebirth after years of hardship. Simultaneously, I began to nurture myself in ways I hadn't before. I looked at myself in the mirror and started to appreciate what I saw. I pursued aesthetic enhancements that Rogerio had dismissed as frivolous. I started exercising, not out of obligation, but for the feeling of well-being. My online presence grew. Simple recipes became popular, and brands reached out to me. For the first time, I earned my own income, supporting my daughter and transforming our small apartment into a home. Evenings, Lilith continued to appear in my dreams. In one, I was in a starlit field. She observed me from afar, as always, but this time, something was different. Her voice, like an echo across the universe, said, "You are on the right path." I awoke filled with pride. My journey had just begun, but I felt empowered to face anything. Rogerio's influence was gone. I was the author of my story, and no one could take that away from me. My life had undergone a complete transformation. I was no longer the submissive woman trapped in a suffocating routine. Now, I was in control of my destiny. My days were filled with caring for my daughter, creating content, and collaborating with brands. It was demanding, but in a fulfilling way, as everything I did was for myself and my daughter. Over time, brands sought me out. My simple recipes, once a means of survival, now supported me. I could afford a good school for my daughter and finally had a place I could call home. But Lilith never drifted far. Sometimes, during quieter nights, I felt her presence. It was as if the air around me thickened, a warm sensation enveloping me. It wasn't frightening, but a constant reminder of her watchful presence. One night, after a long day, I fell into a deep sleep. As usual, Lilith appeared in my dream. She stood in a starlit field, just as in the previous dream. But this time, she was closer. Her eyes shone like molten gold, and her voice echoed from within me. "You have grown, Letícia. You have broken your chains, found your strength. But remember, freedom has a price. Never forget where you came from and who you are now. Evil never retreats. It always finds its way back." I awoke with these words etched in my mind. It felt as if Lilith was warning me, preparing me for something. Yet, a strange peace settled over me. I knew that as long as she was there, I was not alone. Ivana contacted me again. She appeared at my door one afternoon, her serene gaze seeming to hold more than her words conveyed. "You are doing well," she said. "But remember, Letícia, the strength you possess must be nurtured. Do not let anyone take it from you again." Her words resonated with me. I knew my journey was not over. Lilith had given me the strength to start anew, but the rest was my responsibility. Now, looking back at everything I've endured, I see that each pain, each tear, each struggle brought me here. It wasn't easy, and it never will be. But today, I am someone I never imagined I could be. And as night falls and silence fills the house, sometimes I still feel that warmth. It is Lilith, I know, observing, guiding, reminding me that the freedom I have earned cannot be forgotten. And remember, evil never retreats. It always finds its way back.